China, which has just demonstrated an orbital or suborbital hypersonic capability, and China, who also has been identified as expanding their ICBM missile fields, are all issues that need to be taken into consideration of the threats facing the United States. Now, the headlines have piled up. China threatens Australia with missile attack. North Korea threatens nuclear attack on Washington, D.C. North Korea threatens Japan with real ballistic missile. North Korea threatens to sink Japan, reduce U.S. to ashes and darkness. Iran threatens to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And of course, now we have Putin, who threats the West, and his statement was that he would unleash such consequences have never been seen in history.
The 2022 annual threat assessment highlights some of these connections as it provides the IC's baseline of the most pressing threats to U.S. national interests. The assessment starts with threats from key state actors, beginning with the People's Republic of China, which remains an unparalleled priority for the intelligence community, and then turns to Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And all four governments have demonstrated the capability and intent to promote their interest in ways that cut against U.S. interests and allied interests. The PRC is coming ever closer to being a peer competitor in areas of relevance to national security, is pushing to revise global norms and institutions to its advantage, and is challenging the United States in multiple arenas, but particularly economically, militarily, and technologically. China is especially effective at bringing together a coordinated whole-of-government approach to demonstrate its strength and to compel neighbors to acquiesce to its preferences, including its territorial and maritime claims and assertions of sovereignty over Taiwan. President Xi Jinping and China's other leaders are determined to force unification with Taiwan on Beijing's terms. China would prefer coerced unification that avoids armed conflict, and it has been stepping up diplomatic, economic, military pressure on the island for years to isolate it and weaken confidence in its democratically elected leaders. And at the same time, Beijing is preparing to use military force if it decides this is necessary. The PRC is also engaged in the largest ever nuclear force expansion and arsenal diversification in its history, is working to match or exceed U.S. capabilities in space and present the broadest, most active, and persistent cyber espionage threat to U.S. government and private sector networks.
So I'm going to ask each of the three of you, are you directly involved in the nuclear posture review, and what would your advice be, knowing that we now have authoritarian regimes that are making open statements about threatening their neighbors, the use of nuclear weapons, and Vladimir Putin changing his posture, and China significantly investing in both their ICBM fields and in their hypersonics. What should we be doing with our nuclear posture review so that we can deter these authoritarian regimes in the future? Director Haines, Burns, and General Berrier.
Thank you. So my staff and ODNI is involved in the nuclear posture review, as am I in the context of principals meetings on these discussions. Our role, however, is not a policy role. So I don't provide and did not provide my advice as to whether or not to take a particular posture in the review. What we do is provide essentially the intelligence community's assessments on issues that we're asked about in the context of that review.
Before we go to Director Burns, would it be correct to characterize that likely your assessment is that the threat is increasing?
That the threat is increasing generally, yes. I think that's fair.
Director Burns?
No, all I would add is I absolutely agree that the threat is increasing, and I think our role is to try to provide insight from the intelligence community into the plans, the ambitions, the pace at which, adversaries, whether it's China or Russia, can move on these issues. And all I would add is that I think it's very important for us not to underestimate either the scope of those ambitions or the pace at which they can move. I think China and hypersonics is one example of that.
Ranking member, I do believe that the threat is increasing. We are involved in the study, and our role is to really provide the best foundational military intelligence we have related to these kinds of weapons, facilities, organizations, and doctrine that we can, so that policymakers can make the right decision.
In 2019, Director Coates said that Russia and China were more aligned than at any point since the mid-1950s, and the relationship is likely to strengthen. Director Haines, let me ask you, do you believe that's still the case? Was it more the case before this invasion? Has this changed that calculus? And do we believe that Beijing is looking at this as surprised, perhaps, as Putin was of the Western response?
Thank you, Representative. I think Director Coates was exactly right. I believe that it continues to be the case that they are getting closer together. We see that across a range of sectors, economic, political, security, and expect it to continue. I think there's a limit to which it will go, but nevertheless, that remains a concern. And in terms of the impact of the current crisis, I'd say that it's not yet clear to me exactly how it will affect the trajectory of their relationship. I think it's clear that China has not come out and criticized Russia for their actions, clearly, and yet at the same time, they did abstain, for example, in the context of the UN Security Council resolution and in other scenarios. And it does seem as if they are potentially paying a price for not criticizing Russia, and that may have an impact on how this trajectory moves forward. But I think, in general, I think it does continue to the two countries get closer together, and others may have thoughts.
All I would add, Congressman, is I think Director Coates was right, and I think, if anything, that relationship, the partnership between Russia and China has strengthened since 2019. I would add, though, that I think the President Xi and the Chinese leadership are a little bit unsettled by what they're seeing in Ukraine. They did not anticipate the significant difficulties the Russians were going to run into. I think they're unsettled by the reputational damage that can come by their close association with President Putin, second by the economic consequences at a moment when, they're facing lower annual growth rates than they've experienced for more than 3 decades. I think they're a little bit unsettled about the impact on the global economy. And third, I think they're a little bit unsettled by the way in which Vladimir Putin has driven Europeans and Americans much closer together. I think they've, valued their relationship with Europe and valued what they believe to be their capacity to try to drive wedges between us and the Europeans. And so I think that's unsettling for them as well.
But China is investing billions of dollars, we know, in its domestic semiconductor industry in an attempt to achieve full chip independence by 2050. I'm wondering what the assessment of the likelihood of China fully indigenizing its chip industry by then. What sort of security threats would you assess China's increased chip independence creates? And how can the U.S. and its allies address those threats moving forward?
So, Congressman, this is a very timely question, and as we look at China increasingly become more indigenous in their production, this has great concern for us. In terms of the broader impacts, I would like to talk about this a little bit more this afternoon because I can provide a depth I think that's very important for us to cover.
Okay, thank you. Do you perceive a threat that the Chinese-made chips could also be exported abroad, or is this a topic that you just would rather discuss in the closed setting?
If we can talk in closed setting, that'd be great.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me shift gears then, and we'll revisit that topic in the closed setting. General Berrier, some experts have voiced concerns that Russia's invasion of Ukraine could embolden the PRC to pursue a full-scale invasion or military blockade of Taiwan. What's your assessment of the likelihood of a copycat effect, and what more can the U.S. do to prevent the crisis in Ukraine from being repeated in Taiwan?
Congressman, I think Taiwan and Ukraine are two different things completely. I also believe that our deterrence posture in the Pacific puts a very different perspective on all of this. We do know that the PRC watching very, very carefully what happens and how this plays out throughout the entire dime, and I would address more of this in the closed session.
Okay.
So if some of us see this catastrophic decision by the Russian government as a storm, but China is more like the climate, right? And it remains the persistent existential long-term threat. So, Director Haines, how are we going to stay focused on China as we work this emergency in Ukraine?
Yeah, Unquestionably, we are going to stay focused on China, and I agree with you. It is one of those things where the urgent crowds out the important on some level, and we are working very hard to ensure that that does not happen because we recognize the long-term priority is China for us. I think absolutely unparalleled, and I know my colleagues are.
And is it fair to say the resources of the IC, I know a lot of that's classified, but it's fair to say the resources of the IC will reflect that in terms of
Yes.
how we budget and how we prioritize?
Yes, sir.
Director Haines, what can Taiwan, the government of Taiwan, learn from the Ukrainian government right now about how to prepare and stave off an invasion of Taiwan?
That's a great question. I should give that some consideration. Let me come back to you on that. It's
I would
very
appreciate
interesting.
that.
Yeah.
You know, the Chinese government must have misjudged our resolve and our collective ability to inflict economic harm on those who would engage in malign aggression. Director Burns, do you think there's any opening whatsoever for us and the Chinese to have a more productive conversation about Taiwan or their malign intentions, given that they may have thrown in their lot with the wrong horse, the Russians, at this point?
Well, Congressman, I would just say analytically, I would not underestimate President Xi and the Chinese leadership's determination with regard to Taiwan. I do think, as Director Haines said earlier, they've been surprised and unsettled to some extent by what they've seen in Ukraine over the last 12 days. Everything from the strength of the Western reaction to the way in which Ukrainians have fiercely resisted to the relatively poor
But you don't
performance
see an
of Russian
opening right
military-
now
on
for,
Taiwan.
yeah.
No, I mean, I think there's an impact on the Chinese calculus with regard to Taiwan, which we obviously are going to continue to pay careful attention to.
Thank you. Could you also do an assessment of the threat to democracy in Latin America, for example, and the effectiveness of China and Russia to supplant the U.S. as the partner of choice to countries that have been reliable allies?
Yes, we can absolutely provide to you an assessment on that.
And does the IC observe the anti-democratic heads of state in Latin America amplifying Russia's malign influence messaging in the region designed to sow distrust in the U.S.? Is that a part of their plan?
I think, as your question indicates, many countries in Latin America, and as our assessment indicates, are essentially under pressure, economic pressure, political pressure, a variety of different forms of pressure, and as a consequence are being forced to make decisions about whether or not they accept what is frequently an open hand from Russia or China, but with a price tag, essentially, for a variety of different projects that might be useful to those leaders in the context of their work, but nevertheless are expected to buy influence, in effect, within their countries. And so we do see that.
Do you believe the use of surveillance technology is likely to increase in Latin America for the same purpose?
I think the likelihood of surveillance technology to increase around the world is likely.